Alrighty. Hello, everyone. My name is Connor Nichols. I'm an AmeriCorps member through the Conservation Nebraska Common Ground program. I wanted to thank everybody for coming to this program focusing on the growing issue of disease in Nebraska. We're going to be outlining the increasing cases of diseases such as Lyme or West Nile virus, as well as some of the causes that lead to this increase and what can kind of be done to avoid them. Just a few reminders for everybody. Those of you who are online will have their cameras off and microphones muted, so you can't be seen or heard. Any questions you may have can be put into the Q&A section or the chat towards the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer them at the end of the presentation. Additionally, this webinar is being recorded, so if you miss anything or you just want to watch it again, you will be able to find it in a few weeks posted on Conservation Nebraska's YouTube channel, which is under the name Conservation Nebraska. Lastly, there will be a short poll towards the end of the webinar. If you could please fill that out, that really helps us out here at Conservation Nebraska. It lets us know if you learned something, if you liked what you saw, and it also helps us get more grant funding so we can continue to do events like these. With that being said, allow me to introduce our speaker, Dr. Joseph Fauver. Dr. Fauver is an assistant professor of epidemiology at the University of Nebraska Medical Center's College of Public Health. He received his PhD in medical entomology from Colorado State University and went on to postdoctoral research positions at Washington University in St. Louis and the Yale School of Public Health. At UNMC, his lab's research focus is on understanding and mitigating the risk of vector-borne diseases, both locally and abroad. Now that introductions are done, I'll let Dr. Fauver take it away.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Connor. And I appreciate the invite, and I'm excited to chat with you all today about vector-borne diseases, climate change, the effects of these things both locally here in Nebraska and elsewhere. So I'm going to share my screen and get the presentation going. Can you all see that okay?
Yep.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Again, yeah, I appreciate the invite, and I'm always excited to sort of get an opportunity to chat to people about things that I think are important and things that hopefully by the end of this you all do too. So as Connor said, my name is Joseph Fauver. I'm an assistant professor here at UNMC in the College of Public Health, and my research focus in my research lab is focused broadly on pathogen genomics and genomic epidemiology. And we're specifically interested in seeing how we can apply these approaches of genomics, sequencing the genome or the DNA of pathogens that are transmitted both by vectors like mosquitoes and ticks, as well as a series of neglected tropical diseases, things like hookworms, soil transmitted helminths, various parasites, things like that. So that's my position here at UNMC. So a bit on a personal note, I'm actually from Nebraska originally. I'm from Springfield, Nebraska. I did my undergraduate degree just about an hour down south at Peru State College is where I sort of got kicked off on this whole science endeavor that I found myself on. Thrilled to be back in Nebraska and thrilled to be talking to you all about things that are sort of near and dear to my heart and important to Nebraskans. So today, we're going to talk about climate change. We're going to talk about infectious disease, and we're going to talk about how those things may be affecting or how climate may be affecting infectious diseases. And specifically, I'm going to limit the sort of breadth of my discussion to vector-borne diseases. And we'll talk more about what that is, because that's where my background and expertise really lie. Like I said, I got my PhD in medical entomology, so studying arthropods, insects, mosquitoes, ticks, things like that transmit diseases. So that's really where sort of the background and the focus of where I'm coming from here. I am not an expert on climate change. I'm not an expert on the effects of climate change, but we do deal with it when we're thinking about the transmission dynamics and the epidemiology of important things like vector-borne diseases. So today, to sort of start us off here, I want to make sure that we have sort of a common language to discuss these things. I think this is a really useful way to outline and start. So again, sort of the big buckets we have here are climate change and vector-borne diseases. So how are we defining this? I've actually taken this definition from some of my colleagues here at UNMC, people like Jesse Bell, who are real experts in this space, that study the effects of climate on human health, both locally and internationally. And I've really sort of liked what they landed on here. This thinking of climate change as sort of a long-term continuous change in the averages, whether that be average precipitation going up or down, average temperature, temperature of water, temperature of air, things like that. So a few sort of notes about this that I'm laying out here, because I think they'll be important for understanding this in the context of vector-borne disease transmission. One is that mean global temperatures have increased by 1 degree Celsius since the pre-industrial area, and much of that increase has come in the last 50 years. And this can can result in a variety of things. So in general, we are seeing fewer colder days and more warmer days, fewer colder nights, more warmer nights. This also has resulted in changes of the global hydrological cycles. So things like more droughts, more floods in different areas. But importantly, this last note here is that the effects of climate change are highly heterogeneous and they're highly variable on a year-to-year basis. So when we're thinking about the risk of something like vector-borne diseases that hopefully I show you here in a little bit, are absolutely affected by changes in climate and changes in hydrological cycles. This is, there really is no coverall statement that we can make from that. These things differ on time scales and on geographical scales. Okay, so back, so more so into my area of expertise here. What are vector-borne diseases? What is a vector-borne disease? This is what we spend most of our time thinking about in my lab, which is wonderful. We spend a lot of time thinking about bugs. So the definition that we'll put up on the board here is vector-borne diseases are human, animal, or plant illnesses caused by parasites, viruses, and bacteria, sort of umbrella term that we would refer to those as pathogens, and they are transmitted by vectors. So I've underlined sort of the important aspects here. There's things that get the disease, and most instances we're concerned about human health. So vector-borne diseases are diseases that humans get. And they're caused by some microorganism or pathogen. Parasites, viruses, bacteria are the common ones. And what sort of makes those different from any other sort of infectious disease transmission cycle, something like maybe SARS-CoV-2 or influenza virus that are transmitted from person to person, we have this this other factor here, the vector itself. So what is a vector? The way we define a vector is they're hematophagous arthropods capable of transmitting infectious agents or pathogens to their host. So we can break this word down here. Hematophagous would mean literally to feed upon blood. So I think a sort of more layperson's term would be to say blood-sucking insects. Although we are saying arthropods and not insects, this is maybe a semantic discussion at this point. But the reason we use arthropods, which is sort of a higher level biological classification, is because not all vectors are insects. Specifically, one that we were really concerned about here in Nebraska and elsewhere in the US are ticks. Ticks are actually arachnids. They're more closely related to spiders than they are to insects. But most other vectors are actually blood-feeding insects. Things we're really familiar with, like mosquitoes, and then again, the ticks there. There's a variety of other vector species that we're not really going to dive into today, not because they're not important or interesting, but as far as sort of the public health impact of the diseases they transmit aren't quite as broad or sort of affecting local populations here. So there's hundreds of species of hematophagous arthropods that, anything from mosquitoes and ticks to phlebotomine sandflies to fleas to black flies that can transmit onchocerciasis to kissing bugs down here that can transmit Chagas disease. So there's lots of things, but again, our focus today is going to be up here on the mosquitoes and ticks. So the last thing, so we've talked about the host, we're almost exclusively talking about humans today. We've talked about the vector species of arthropods that can transmit these diseases, and we should talk about what the pathogens are themselves. So there's three main sort of high-level categories of microbes or pathogens that are transmitted to humans via the bite of a vector. And these are viruses, what we would refer to as arbovirus. So arbo would stand for arthropod-borne viruses. And then the vector-transmitted bacteria and parasites. So this is a list from the World Health Organization. sort of breaking these down by the vector, the disease they cause, and the type of pathogen that it is. So when we're talking about arboviruses, I'm sure folks in the audience here are very familiar with some of these. West Nile virus, for example, is an incredibly important arthropod-borne virus for the state of Nebraska. We have other arboviruses that are really important both in the US and abroad, things like dengue virus, chikungunya virus. You all may remember Zika virus that caused a global pandemic in 2016 when it was introduced into the Americas. We also have the vector-transmitted bacteria that are almost exclusively transmitted by ticks in these cases. So what I'm highlighting down here, Borrelia burgdorferi, is probably the most well-known, which is the causative agent of Lyme disease. So there's a variety of other species of bacteria that are responsible for causing disease in humans, anaplasma, tularemia, things like that. But I would say far and away the most sort of crucial, and as far as just raw case counts, Borrelia burgdorferi, what causes Lyme disease, is far and away the most common. And then finally, we have parasites, which aren't sort of as important sort of here in the U.S., although there is tick-borne AP complexin parasites called Babesia that are really, really important, but far and away the most important vector-borne parasite would be Plasmodium falciparum, the causative agent of malaria that kills north of 1 million people a year. Typically in impoverished and developing countries. So hopefully from there, we were able to sort of describe, we have a common language for what we're going to talk about for the rest of the talk today. We have sort of these climate effects and vector-borne diseases that we've just gone over. So a question here is why are vector-borne diseases a useful model to think about how climate change will affect disease transmission? So I can talk about these because I'm an expert in vector-borne diseases, but they really do sort of lend themselves to ask this question of what will the effects of a changing climate mean for the transmission dynamics of any given diseases. But we can think about this, I think, in a really straightforward way when we're talking about vector-borne diseases. And mostly, it's because climatic factors such as temperature, humidity, precipitation, things like that directly affect these systems, right? And first and foremost, it's because arthropod development is largely dependent upon the environment. So arthropods, mosquitoes, ticks, the insects that we're talking about here, are ectothermic, meaning that they're quote unquote cold-blooded. So they require certain temperatures, certain levels of humidity, certain levels of precipitation to actually develop. So what I'm showing you here is just a picture of a mosquito life cycle. So if for folks that were unaware, mosquitoes actually spend most of their lives in an aquatic environment. They'll lay, the females will lay eggs on the water. They'll hatch into larvae. They'll turn into pupae. So if you've ever had a water, like a bird bath in your yard, it looks like there's little worms in it. It's mosquito larvae. Then the adult will emerge. They'll mate. The female will take a blood meal. That's when transmission of disease can occur, and they'll use that blood to make eggs. But this whole cycle of going from an egg to a larvae to an adult is dependent on a certain set of climatic factors. So certain temperatures are important, certain amounts of humidity are important for that. And then sort of the other side of this is not focused solely on the vector itself, but actually the pathogen inside the vector. So the ability of a vector, so a mosquito or tick, to actually transmit a pathogen is also affected by temperature. This is just a cross section of mosquitoes. So if you were to cut this mosquito directly in half, this is what you would see. And it's sort of laying out the biology that occurs when a mosquito is exposed to a virus. It has to infect the mosquito midgut. It then gets into the lumen, which would be sort of like the mosquito circulatory system, eventually back to its salivary glands when it bites the next person, and it spits. So when mosquitoes bite you, they'll actually spit into your blood vessels. That's when the virus can be transmitted. And that whole process within the mosquito is also affected by temperature. Typically, these things will happen quicker if they're warmer. So to put this as sort of simply as possible, vectors and the pathogens that they transmit do better in warmer environments. So I think it stands to reason to think if we are seeing sort of global scale increases in temperature, the sort of logical conclusion of that could be that we are going to experience more vector-borne diseases. So that's sort of what I want to lay out for you here. So how do we know the effects of climate on vector-borne diseases? Is there a simple answer to this question? No, it's incredibly complicated. That's part of the beauty of it, and in my eyes, part of the reason I became interested in studying vector-borne diseases and pursuing a PhD in is how complicated the life cycle is. Because you can see there's a lot of different areas where things can ebb and flow. So in general, I think this is a sort of uncontroversial thing to say, a safe statement to say that in general, increasing temperature globally will result in an increased incidence of vector-borne diseases, sort of period, end of sentence. But that does not mean that that will always be the case. So there are a few, in my mind, really sort of important exceptions to consider when we're thinking about, increases in global temperatures and how that's associated with the increase of vector-borne diseases. One is it can actually indeed be too hot for vector-borne disease transmission to occur. So what this graph is showing you is sort of this optimal temperature range where they're on the y-axis here, they're showing a value called relative R naught. R naught's the effective reproductive number. Basically, as R naught goes up, the likelihood of disease transmission occurring goes up. And what we can see is for all these different colored lines are different vector-borne disease systems, pathogens on the left, vectors on the right. We can see is that for all of these, there is sort of an optimal temperature at which transmission can occur for a variety of different reasons. So, if we are falling outside of these bell curves on one way or the other, and thinking about increasing global temperatures, thinking about falling out on the right side of it, there is actually instances where it can be too hot for vector-borne diseases to occur. Now, that's, again, painting with far too broad of a brush. That's really sort of a question about local transmission dynamics. But there's examples of this, of places in sub-Saharan Africa where malaria transmission used to occur and has become too hot for the mosquitoes, Anopheles species, typically Anopheles gambiae species mosquitoes, to actually thrive. Importantly here, though, is that there are many other factors that determine the transmission potential of vector-borne diseases. It takes a lot for vector-borne diseases to actually be transmitted, which is sort of counterintuitive because there are so many cases of vector-borne diseases globally every year, but it's really not sort of a straightforward or easy thing to occur. And instead of sort of laying out the scenario of all of these different factors that affect whether or not a mosquito or tick is going to transmit a pathogen to someone, we can sort of lay out in my mind, a sort of counterfactual here. So as I showed you earlier, global temperatures have increased. A lot of the sort of rate of that increase has occurred over the last 50 years. But if we look back historically in the US, there used to be plenty of vector-borne disease transmission that is no longer occurring. So what I'm showing you here are instances of historical outbreaks of yellow fever virus. There's a wonderful book about this called The American Plague by Molly Caldwell that sort of characterizes many of these, specifically these yellow fever outbreaks that occurred in Memphis. So yellow fever is a flavivirus. It's one of the few vector-borne diseases we have a vaccine against, and thankfully so. It's an incredibly deadly disease. But well into the 1800s, there used to be routine outbreaks of yellow fever in the US. And then alongside that, you can tell that this is an old picture due to the quality of it. Much of the US actually used to be endemic for malaria. So right now we sort of think of malaria as a disease that is confined to the tropics, where the vast majority of the morbidity and mortality associated with it is occurring in sub-Saharan Africa, where, in 1882, large swaths of the US used to be endemic. Nebraska was a malaria zone at the time. And then you can see sort of through progression through time, so 1882, 1912, 1932, 1934, we can see that the sort of range of malaria transmission in the US was subsequently shrinking. And it's to the point now where malaria is considered eradicated from the US really since the 40s or 50s. But again, so if we can see sort of the incidence of these vector-borne diseases going down as we are seeing temperatures increasing. So again, this is not always necessarily a direct one-to-one relationship. Just a little fun fact for people interested in bugs like I am, malaria transmission and getting rid of malaria in the US is actually why the CDC is located in Atlanta, Georgia. So the history of the CDC in the US really comes from vector-borne disease transmission. But we're starting to see increases. So what's old is new again. So dengue virus, which is a virus that's similar to yellow fever virus, they're both flaviviruses transmitted by the same species of mosquitoes, now causes routine outbreaks in the US. And I'll show you a map about that in a little bit more. And then actually this year in 2023, in Florida and Texas, and actually I believe Arkansas, there was locally acquired cases of malaria, which does not happen effectively. I mean, it does. It happens occasionally, but for the most part, malaria transmission in the U.S. has ceased for decades. So to see autochthonous transmission, autochthonous is effectively a word saying this wasn't someone that had traveled to, sub-Saharan Africa, got malaria and came back. This means they got bit by a mosquito in Florida or Texas, and that mosquito transmitted Plasmodium vivax in this case to them. So we by no means are sort of free of mosquito transmitted diseases in the US. And that might sort of hint at things to come. So, what I'm trying to show you here is that that's not necessarily a direct one-to-one relationship all the time. But there are instances in where climate change is directly affecting, it's directly changing the dynamics of vector-borne disease transmission. So there's a few instances, recently published literature that's really good examples of this, where we can attribute changing in climate, specifically increases in temperature, to increase in incidence of vector-borne diseases. And sort of the easiest, again, I sort of think this is the most straightforward way to think about this problem, is increasing temperatures in certain areas is now allowing for some vector species to expand their range into areas where they previously had not existed. So there was a study done in the highlands of Ethiopia and also the highlands of Colombia, where malaria transmission historically had not occurred because these communities existed at such an elevation where the sort of average temperature, sort of fell outside that bell curve, right? It was not sort of conducive to malaria transmission. And what they've shown is over the last 10 years, sort of that height of elevation is just steadily increasing. That's due to increased temperatures. We actually see a similar phenomenon with dengue virus transmission. Again, dengue virus is an arbovirus transmitted by mosquitoes. I could give you a whole sort of hour lecture on dengue virus and why it's important. But just for the sake here, this species of mosquito that this person is holding in some forceps here has really increased its range in the last 40 to 50 years in the US. And that range increase is associated with temperatures increasing that are more conducive for these mosquitoes to be in new places. And importantly, it's showing a very, very stark increase in the number of reported dengue virus cases. Now, there's biases in these data, as there are all sorts of data. Reported is the important word here on this y-axis. Not all cases of dengue get reported, but importantly, this y-axis is in millions. So there's probably tens of millions of cases of dengue that are occurring yearly at this point, and at least in the Americas, in some places of the Americas, for example, places like Mexico City that also have a higher altitude where previously this mosquito species could not thrive, they're now able to exist in those spaces. This is just a sort of a map to visualize what I'm talking about. Again, sort of how is increasing global temperatures directly resulting in increased risk of vector-borne disease transmission. Aedes albopictus, which is sort of a secondary vector of many of these viruses like dengue virus and Zika virus, has been historically confined to sort of the subtropics, and we've sort of seen a steady march north. So I actually live in Omaha, in the Hanscom Park neighborhood, and we routinely find these mosquitoes in our backyard every summer. So they have sort of firmly become established here, and they're going further north. So this photo, or this diagram on the right is sort of showing a modeled expansion of the range of this species of mosquito. So again, thinking about what is this association between climate change and increasing in these averages and the effects on vector-borne diseases, there are instances where that sort of direct relationship exists. That being said, I think probably the more surely the more complicated, but probably something that we should consider more of as sort of broadly as a field, is what are the indirect effects of climate change on vector-borne disease transmission risk? So, I've talked so far today, about increasing global temperature and sort of that relationship with vector species and their ability to transmit pathogens. But we know that climate change sort of shows up in a number of different ways that it is more so than just increasing global temperatures. The results of that can do lots of things, and oftentimes, these sort of extreme weather events that are associated with climate change, extreme floods, droughts, things like that, can also directly have an effect on vector-borne disease transmission. And a really unfortunate example of this were the floods that occurred in Pakistan in 2022, where whole communities were inundated with water for weeks. And as they say here in this headline, it was a perfect storm for malaria transmission to occur. So they saw a 300-fold increase in cases. Over 1.6 million cases were diagnosed that year, which was 3 times the amount of cases that were diagnosed the previous year in Pakistan. And that's not necessarily just because people are always exposed more, is because sort of the disruptive effects of these extreme weather events also sort of halt global disease control campaigns. So folks weren't able to get out and give bed nets in these communities, for example, to protect folks. So climate change resulting in sort of displacement events, social unrest, mass migration of people. So there's this sort of phenomenon now known as climate migrants, where individuals who are now displaced from their homes or displaced from where they live due to climate instability. So another example of this would be droughts in the Horn of Africa or in the Sahel region, that's resulting in large-scale mass migration events. And the reason I bring this up is because it's sort of near and dear to my heart right now. I just spent about 2 weeks in Chad. So for folks that may not know, Chad is this large country in Central Africa that's sort of in the Sahel region. And there are really large refugee populations that sort of exists on this border between Chad and Sudan. And there's currently a dengue virus outbreak. There's a dengue virus outbreak in the middle of the Saharan desert. So it seems counterintuitive. So this isn't really climate change directly resulting in this dengue virus outbreak, but what it is resulting is climate instability and folks that are being uprooted from their homes and are now a part of these refugee populations. And they find themselves in these camps, and these camps themselves sort of select for vector-borne disease transmission. Standing water, stagnant water, things that people are lacking to prevent vector-borne disease transmission, like screens on houses, air conditioning, ways to prevent mosquito bites, are no longer occurring. And what you end up with are vulnerable populations of people where vector-borne disease transmission is occurring in areas where it never should. So that's sort of an example of climate change indirectly changing the transmission dynamics of vector-borne diseases. So let's bring it back a little bit closer to home. What's another example of these phenomenon that we are seeing that are indirectly changing transmission dynamics of vector-borne diseases? So one of them, so climate change is absolutely resulting in changing patterns of land use, so sort of because of climate change and also around it, right? It's not land use changes are not solely due to climate change, right? But the climate change can affect those things. And part of this can be due to variability in precipitation. So we are in Nebraska, and agriculture is clearly a very important aspect of the Nebraska economy. And we have been in, for years now, what would be considered a drought across the state. Oops, shoot, I lost a figure. So one thing that's been associated with this drought in Nebraska is sort of this steady increase in the amount of irrigated agriculture that occurs across the state. So there's parts of the state that historically we had not had to irrigate to get a crop. And I'm painting with a broad brush here. I do know that it's much more complicated than that, but there is sort of this association with increased agriculture, or excuse me, increased irrigated agriculture, and the incidence of West Nile virus. So West Nile virus, again, it's an arbovirus. It's transmitted by this species over here, Culex tarsalis, and Culex pipiens in Nebraska. Their ecologies are slightly different and interesting, I believe. And what this species of mosquito loves is sort of temporary, pristine bodies of water. And you often get that in areas where irrigated agriculture is occurring. So actually, when I was a PhD student at Colorado State, I helped run the West Nile virus surveillance program for the city of Fort Collins, Colorado, in the eastern side of the city, of the foothills, where they were growing row crops. There was irrigated agriculture occurring, and sort of the ruts of the sprinklers would always fill up with water, and we would find tens of thousands of these species of mosquitoes. So having a lot of mosquitoes in general is associated with a higher risk of West Nile virus transmission. And as you can see here, the darker color means the higher incidence, the more cases. And in places where irrigated agriculture is occurring in Nebraska and the Dakotas, we see this increase in West Nile virus incidence. So again, this is sort of an indirect effect of something like droughts that are associated with climate change, resulting in changes of land use, which is resulting in an increased risk of some vector-borne diseases. So let's sort of stay in Nebraska here and sort of think about local disease transmission. So West Nile virus, far and away, is the most important mosquito-borne disease, not only in the United States, but really in Nebraska. Nebraska has the fourth highest cumulative cases of West Nile virus since the virus was introduced and first detected in New York in 1999. And cumulative cases, so saying since 1999 to now, which states have had the most cases, and Nebraska's fourth on that list, and only behind Texas, Colorado, and California. And those states have much, much larger populations than we do, and Nebraska has one of the highest, if not the highest, incidence of West Nile virus in the country. And you know, sort of climate change is indirectly affecting those transmission dynamics. So the other sort of important set of diseases, vector-borne diseases, for folks in Nebraska would be tick-borne diseases. So I sort of want to walk you through the emerging tick-borne diseases that are occurring across the state, sort of the timeline of how these have occurred. So first things first, we're going to talk about Ixodes scapularis. That is the deer tick, or the black-legged tick, that is more than capable of transmitting Borrelia burgdorferi, the causative agent of Lyme disease. So there's this paper published, folks from University of Nebraska-Lincoln and UNMC published, I believe, in 2018 or 2019, showing the first record of Ixodes scapularis tick populations being found in 3 counties in Nebraska. And then, surely enough, shortly after these ticks were identified in Nebraska, they detected Borrelia burgdorferi, the pathogen in the tick, and specifically in an area where the first confirmed case of Lyme disease was occurring in the state. And this is in 2021. So this is something that is sort of actively happening. And important to note here, this is a really great group effort between folks from UNMC, UNL, Jeff Hammock, who's at Nebraska DHHS, who runs the vector control program. It's fantastic. They've been working on this sort of since it happened. So what we have now, as of 2021, is autochthonous transmission of Lyme disease, where people are getting bitten by ticks in Nebraska, and Lyme disease is being transmitted to them. So this is actually a map that we recently put together for a grant submission, and filled in counties here in the state of Nebraska where Ixodes scapularis ticks have been identified and recently collected. And interestingly, what we know is we have these sort of 2 foci in the state, in the northeast corner and then sort of in central Douglas and Sarpy County. And this first case of autochthonous transmission of Lyme disease occurred in Thurston County, Nebraska, where they first identified these ticks. So that sort of begs the question, is this directly or indirectly or not at all a result of a changing climate? This is the reason we are now seeing Lyme disease transmission because of climate change in some capacity or another. So what I'm showing you here now is the sort of range of the black-legged tick. So that's I should have put this picture up earlier. That's the deer tick. That's the culprit. Thankfully, that's not actually the size. They are much smaller than that. Well, thankfully ticks aren't that big, but if they were that big, they'd be easier to see. But what I'm showing you up here is sort of the known distribution of where these ticks occur across the United States. So again, sort of thinking about this direct effect, right? increasing uh, vector ranges, expanding their ranges as a result of something like increased temperature and increased suitability. Well, for folks in the crowd that know something about Lyme disease, it's actually named after Lyme, Connecticut, the town where it was first identified in. But if we just start looking at sort of latitudes and if we can agree that the north part of the U.S. is warmer than the southern part of the U.S., there's been Lyme disease transmission occurring in the Northeast and the upper Midwest in places like Minnesota and Wisconsin for decades now. The vast majority of Lyme disease transmission occurs in the New England area and up in Minnesota. And there's Lyme disease transmission as far north as Canada. So is this really the result, seeing this emergence of this tick-borne disease in Nebraska really the result of increasing temperatures in the state? I don't think there's evidence for that personally. Now, is it indirectly the result of that? Potentially. Again, land use is really important. Habitat fragmentation, forest fragmentation, where these ticks find themselves, potentially the availability of secondary hosts. They're called deer ticks for a reason. They love to feed on deer. We've seen increases in white-tailed deer populations in Nebraska. So are there some potentially indirect effects of a changing climate on the transmission of this? Absolutely. But it's sort of direct one-to-one correlation. Probably not. We are sort of actively working to try to work out sort of the disease ecology of Lyme disease in Nebraska, because it is interesting that it seems like these ticks could have been here for a while and been perfectly happy here, but we haven't found them until recently. So we can sort of contrast that with another tick that's really important to the state, the Lone Star tick. And Roberto Cortinas, who's also in the previous paper, is a professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, has done an exceptional job of sort of documenting the march of this tick into the state of Nebraska. So why do we care about the Lone Star tick? So this is actually a screenshot from an article from the Flatwater Free Press talking about this Lone Star tick. It's called a Lone Star tick because it has that little dot on its on the back for the female ticks. This is actually a perfect picture of tick questing behavior, where they throw their arms up, they get on vegetation, and they have these organs on their arms that detect carbon dioxide, and that's what they use to sort of latch onto people. Anyways, so this Lone Star tick is more than capable of transmitting a variety of different pathogens, bacteria, really important viruses like Lone Star virus, or excuse me, Heartland virus and Bourbon virus. But probably the most concerning at the moment, and for folks in Nebraska, as this tick, so as the result of this paper, showed that this tick over the last 20 years has expanded northward and really sort of dug in eastern Nebraska. As the bite of this tick can cause what's called alpha-gal syndrome or alpha-galactose syndrome, which is sort of a fancy way to say a meat allergy. So the way that works, these ticks have, again, similar to how I mentioned mosquitoes. When mosquitoes bite you, they spit inside you. Ticks do the same thing. When they bite you, they spit inside you. And that spit is full of all sorts of proteins and immunogenic things. And some of those you will develop an immune response to. And in some people, that immune response will look eerily similar. So the antibodies they develop will attack things that look eerily similar to proteins in red meat. So there's this very well described phenomenon now of people getting bitten by ticks, specifically this species of tick, and sometime in the future, then have a sort of a bad allergic response when they consume meat or animal products. And this New York Times article here suggests that there's hundreds of thousands of cases of alpha-gal syndrome collectively in the U.S., but it's one of those things that is emerging as this tick emerges. So we can sort of ask that same question, these sort of new disease risks that we're experiencing in the state. Is this directly or indirectly the result of climate change? Where I think for Amblyomma americanum, the Lone Star tick here, there is much more sort of direct evidence for that. These ticks have made a steady march from the southeast northward. And part of that is absolutely the result of increasing temperatures, not having as many hard freezes in the winter, habitat availability. So, one thing, the reason to contrast this, besides to let you know that these diseases are in Nebraska and we should be aware of them, but the reasons really to contrast them is to show that, we can't really make a coverall statement about how climate change is actually affecting the risk of vector-borne disease transmission, because it is indeed very complicated. So what are some of the takeaways of what I've talked about here today? One is hopefully you come with the appreciation that the spread of vector-borne diseases is an incredibly complex phenomenon. There's a lot that has to happen, but importantly, climactic factors, temperature, precipitation, humidity absolutely play a role in that. There needs to be water sources around for mosquitoes to breed. It has to be a certain temperature. There's a reason why when we go outside right now, we're not getting bit by mosquitoes. It's far too cold for mosquitoes to exist out here right now. So you can imagine sort of on the fringes of where transmission is currently occurring, warmer temperatures may result in expanded host range, vector range, which may result in an increased risk of vector-borne diseases. We can also say definitively that the incidence of vector-borne diseases is increasing drastically, both locally here in the United States. I had a graph that I probably should have put in, but there's been a steady increase in vector-borne diseases across the U.S. over the last 20 to 25 years, which is largely due to the increase in Lyme disease diagnoses, and then abroad as well. I can't talk about sort of the effects of climate change and vector-borne diseases without talking about this problem on a global scale. There's sort of many impoverished populations that are absolutely sort of bearing the brunt of this right now. So, and importantly, climate change and these changes are affecting vector-borne diseases in some sort of obvious and clear ways, like increasing temperatures, but some not as obvious ways. Things like increasing irrigated agriculture due to increased likelihood of drought, or seeing sort of climate migrants whose homes have been sort of uprooted by climate instability and vulnerability, and then they find themselves in areas like refugee camps where vector-borne disease transmission occurs widely. And importantly, this relationship really is not always clear. It's really hard to paint with a broad brush, and it is incredibly, it is sort of incredibly complicated here. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with, as I am somehow staying on time for this talk, is this question: what can we do? I'm in public health. I would not say I'm an epidemiologist, although I am in an epidemiology department. So we sort of look at these things and realize that these things are happening. But importantly here, we are not helpless. There are things that we can do about it. I'm not going to talk about what we can do to sort of reduce our carbon footprint or reduce, our sort of contributions to climate change. That's a different topic that I am by no means qualified to discuss. But I can talk to you about how we can prevent our own personal risk of vector-borne diseases. So I'm going to end my talk with talking about tick bite prevention and mosquito bite prevention. Things that I'm assuming in the audience here at Conservation Nebraska means there's a lot of folks that like to spend a lot of time outside, like myself. So these are things that I try to do. I say try because I don't do them all the time, to prevent the likelihood that I get a tick or mosquito-borne disease. So importantly, all vector-borne diseases, the prevention of vector bites is the best way to prevent transmission. There is no Lyme disease vaccine currently, although one is being developed. There's no West Nile virus vaccine. There's nothing you can take that, sort of a prophylactic to stop, infection after exposure. So the best way to prevent the transmission of vector-borne diseases is to prevent being bitten by the vectors themselves. So how do you do that with ticks? Probably one of the best things, if not the best thing you can do, is wear long sleeves, wear pants, and tuck your pants into your socks. So ticks are almost always sort of on vegetation on the sides of trails. And when they attach, they'll attach sort of low and start walking up. And if they don't have really anywhere to bite onto while you're hiking, you should be in good shape by the time you get home. Avoid ticky habitats. What do we mean by ticky habitats? Areas with long grass on the edges of forests. Places you see deer, you'll probably find ticks. This is when I say avoid, that's not to say don't go to these areas. This is actually a picture of Fontenelle Forest at the wetland. It's one of my favorite trails in Nebraska. I absolutely adore this place. Really, my advice here would be to stay on the path. Stay on the trail. Don't sort of wander off into the tall grass. That's a really great way to get ticks. You can actually treat clothes with permethrin. So permethrin, and you can also use DEET-based repellents for both mosquito and tick repellent. But permethrin's an insecticide that you would treat your clothes with. So this woman on the right is showing sort of how to do this. There's websites like the CDC has tons of information about this to actually treat your clothes with this chemical, let it dry, and then you can wear them for some period of time in the future, and ticks are sort of repelled by this baggy thread. And DEET again, sort of as far as insect repellent goes, DEET works great. And importantly here, I didn't want to show the data to make this too academic, but there's this interesting phenomenon with tick-borne bacteria, specifically Borrelia burgdorferi Lyme disease, is the tick has to be attached for typically up to 24 hours before it can actually get that bacteria into your bloodstream. So if you are, enjoying your time and sort of the beautiful nature that Nebraska has to offer, if you are really diligent about checking yourself for ticks while you are out or when you come back, you can do a really great job at preventing the likelihood of tick-borne disease transmission. There's all sorts of materials out there. Here, I would like to sort of put a plug for the University of Nebraska Lincoln's program called Tick Tag Go. They have their websites. I apologize, I should have put a link to it here, but they have all sorts of information about how to do all of these things properly. And then finally, mosquito-borne prevention, mosquito-borne disease prevention, similar to ticks, but this is really, it's all about personal protection, right? So this is the Beat the Buzz campaign from the city of Fort Collins. I was there when they started developing it. Drain standing water, defend yourself using insect repellents like DEET, dress in long sleeves, and specifically at dusk, the crepuscular hours, in the evening and early in the morning, that's when the species of mosquito that transmits West Nile virus is most active. So if you can be diligent about these things, you can do sort of a great job of protecting yourself from vector-borne disease transmission. Okay, with that, we're about 45 minutes into it. It's great to have the opportunity to come chat with folks about these things, and I hope you learned a little bit about vector-borne diseases and the effects of climate change on those. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for the presentation. That was really informative. I know I personally learned a lot. We do have a few questions that I'll ask. We'll start with some of the probably easier to answer ones. Have a few from Kim Jones. First one, Kim is asking, why a surge for malaria in 1934 after it seemed to be depleting in 1932?
Oh, great question that I absolutely don't know the answer to. So I can talk a little bit about sort of malaria control campaigns in the US. And a lot of that had to do with sort of changing habitat right now. Actually, the practice of terraced farming comes from, in part, mosquito control campaigns in the 30s. DDT was a huge part of the malaria elimination campaigns at that point in time. So there's been a lot discussed about DDT and sort of the environmental catastrophes that it caused. Rachel Carson, Silent Springs. I'm sure I'm preaching to the crowd here. But yeah, why there was a sort of increase in malaria after that, I do not know. But really, so the important thing is the fact that we've seen autochthonous malaria transmission this last year was really sort of surprising to a lot of folks in my space.
Mm-hmm. Next one we have, Kim is also curious if Nebraska doctors are notified of Lyme disease diagnosis in their particular county or city.
Great question. I know that the state does work to expose healthcare professionals to these things. That would probably be a better question for someone like I mentioned earlier, Jeff Hammock, who does the vector-borne disease work here for the state.
Okay. Regarding the ticks, the Lone Star ticks in particular, in their march from the south to the north, is the south getting too hot for them, or is it just more space with their perfect temperature for them to spread out?
Yeah, great question. There's still plenty of Lone Star ticks in the south. So if you look at sort of the distribution of alpha-gal syndrome, you can see that it is really concentrated in sort of the southeast US. We can think of this more so as populations expanding, growing as they're moving sort of outward on their peripheries.
Certainly. Question from Ame Running. I apologize if I pronounce your name incorrectly. What advice would you give to prospective graduate students interested in parasite/wildlife population genetics? who had these classes in undergrad and where possibly to find more experience before grad school.
Awesome. You should totally pursue that because parasites and wildlife population genetics rule. Um, Shoot me an email, I would say. That would be, can I put that in the chat?
Yeah, go for it.
Um, uh, there's all sorts of stuff you can do with that. There's folks sort of across all the universities here in Nebraska. Lots of work being done in this space. UNL in Nebraska. Didn't dive into it too much today, but is sort of historically the world leader in parasitology. So it's a great space to get into. Shoot me an email and we can definitely chat.
Awesome. Question from Fabian Mendez. Are there pros and cons to having a native lawn when it comes to tick and other pest prevention? Are there some plants that do better at preventing pests from making your lawn a home?
That's a really great question. And Jody Green at Nebraska Extension would be the absolute perfect person to answer that. So he's at the extension here in Douglas County and does a lot of work, outreach around sort of entomology. But so oh gosh, yeah, that's a fantastic question. So I can tell you from a mosquito-borne disease standpoint, anytime you're going to have standing water in the summer, you are going to find mosquito larvae in it. So if you can have a yard full of native plants that increases drainage, for example, that would absolutely be a benefit. Um, I can't imagine sort of if you're living, you know, in a neighborhood or in a cul-de-sac or something, you would expect many tick species because the sort of host that they're sort of routinely blood feeding on wouldn't be around. Um, I have to imagine that there's probably someone that has thought a lot about this question. And I'm not 100% sure, but I think sort of in general having native plants is always a good thing to do.
Absolutely. Question from Lisa G. Do ticks transfer from deer to rabbits and other backyard visitors?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I didn't show today is sort of the life. I showed the life cycle of a mosquito going from an egg to a larvae to a pupae to an adult. Um, Ticks work similar in that they start as an egg and then they go to a larval stage or nymphal stages and larval stages, and then they sort of progressively molt and just get bigger. And throughout that process, different species of ticks have different host preferences. So some sort of just hatched ticks will be on things like the white-footed deer mouse, for example, is a really good example where you find lots of exotescapularis ticks on those. There's an exotic species of tick that feeds almost exclusively on rabbits. So yeah, sort of all the animals that you see going around, birds often are really sort of preferred hosts for a lot of species of ticks and mosquitoes as well. So West Nile virus, I didn't mention this, but West Nile virus is actually a disease of birds that humans happen to get. Lots of mosquitoes prefer to feed on birds. So yes, you'll see deer, you'll see ticks on deer, you'll see them on rabbits, you'll see them on mice, squirrels, all sorts of stuff.
Awesome. Question from Bridget Bingham. What are your thoughts on the impact of cities spraying for mosquitoes? Does this contribute to global warming by introducing that into the air?
Yeah, great question. I'm assuming what you're referring to here is sort of citywide campaigns that spray insecticides to kill mosquito populations. My sort of background with that would be my time spent with mosquito control programs in Colorado, and what they did was they tested mosquitoes for the presence of West Nile virus through sort of routine trapping, and they found situations where sort of the population of mosquitoes had so much virus in it that they felt sort of the rewards of spraying to kill those mosquitoes sort of outweighed the cons of doing so. And that's spraying insecticides to kill mosquitoes. I don't think anyone in that business would say that it's like a silver bullet or a perfect tool. There is absolutely sort of unintended consequences of that. Is that necessarily contributing to climate change? I'm not sure about putting the particulate matter in the air. That might have something. Again, that's sort of outside my realm of expertise. There's all sorts of off-target effects that can be really problematic for other arthropod populations that are really important. So it's one of those things that we should use cautiously and when we need to. Unfortunately, So one thing we didn't really talk about today is about sort of the treatment and prevention of mosquito-borne diseases. These things are, mosquitoes are developing resistance to all sorts of insecticides around the world, and the pathogens that they transmit, like malaria, for example, is resistant to almost every drug we've ever exposed it to. So that's sort of a compounding issue of climate change. We're seeing more vector-borne disease transmission. Our ability to control it right now is not very good. So it's going to continue to be a problem because of that.
Mm. Last question we have so far from Peggy Apthorpe. Do you have any suggestions for preventing ticks in pets?
Yeah, great question. Ticks and pets. My dog has a feed-through insecticide that ticks will latch onto him, but they'll bite him and then immediately die. Not immediately, but closely thereafter. So yeah, there's like flea and tick preventative on dogs is important to stay on top of. Talk to your veterinarian about it. But yeah, there's lots of stuff that dogs can take.
Absolutely. Yeah, so for the folks that are still here, I just launched the feedback survey. It's just 4 questions, 3 of which are required, but the 4th one is kind of a bit longer form. If you could just take some time to fill that out, we really appreciate it. But yeah, as we're wrapping up, yeah, I just want to say it was great hearing you talk about it, and learned a lot, honestly, about vector-borne diseases and stuff like that. I definitely didn't know that the United States was endemic for malaria
For a
before
long
this.
time. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
that it's very interesting, especially considering that figure you had, how far north it was. I
Yeah. So the species of, well, there's multiple species of mosquitoes in the United States that are still here that will very happily transmit malaria, as we were shown this summer.
mhm,
Things like Anopheles quadrimaculatus. They're here. It's just we sort of went about it in a variety of other ways, these really large scale control campaigns to get rid of malaria because it is so
mhm,
problematic. It's sort of a fascinating history. That's part of what got me interested in this space in general. My time at Peru State College and working with people like Rich and Deb Clopton that sort of exposed me to the history of parasitology and sort of expanded outward from
mhm,
there. So for the person that asked about, what do I recommend for folks interested in the space? Read the history on it. It is really fascinating.
mhm. Yeah, especially like considering, some of the more extreme examples, like, plague rats and
Mhm.
the fleas and all that stuff. I imagine it's a long and morbid
Yeah.
history.
Yeah, no, it is. So, I mean, the U.S. is endemic for plague too. Now, there's
Mhm,
very few cases. So, there's pneumonic plague that can be transmitted from person to person, but there's also plague that can be transmitted from fleas to people. And actually, the Front Range of Colorado typically sees about 1 case of plague every year because of the prairie dog colonies where the
mhm.
fleas are very happily residing.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess while we're finishing up, is there anything you want to or news that you'd like the folks still here to know about?
No, nothing in particular. I put my email in the chat. If you have any questions, please do reach out. And take mosquito and tick prevention seriously. It's ticks in Nebraska. Lyme disease was something we were hoping we were in New Haven, Connecticut before this, and we were sort of hoping that we would leave Lyme disease there with us. And we come here now. Now there's cases occurring. So be very aware. Take those things seriously. Spend as much time outside as you possibly can because Nebraska is beautiful, but make sure you do tick checks when you get back.
Absolutely. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Fauver, for taking the time to speak to us about this. And thank you, everybody, for coming and listening. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day to attend our events. And we'll wrap